Hey, I'm Paul Watson, one of the authors of Contagious Disciple Making, and recently I got an email from a guy named Neil, somebody I met down at City Team's iDisciple conference in Kansas City, Missouri, and he had a great question, and it was a little involved, and I wanted to make sure that everyone got to hear the answer, so I thought I'd shoot a video. His question was, what do we do with children in our discovery groups? You see, in America, we've got a lot of programs in our churches to get our children involved and keep them kind of entertained while we're in our church services or having our Bible study meetings, and we don't really know what to do with children, and that's a big deal. And as a father of three myself, an 11-year-old, a 9-year-old, and a 3-year-old, what we do with children is pretty important and near and dear to my heart. And so I'd like to take some time just to shoot the video to answer his question, because it's a little bit more involved than an email would want. So the issue with children is that it's a cultural issue. There are some cultures that have a high tolerance for interruption and noise. In Africa, for example, in India, for example, I remember attending churches where a child half dressed or half naked, if you will, ran down the center aisle or would wander back and forth and talk with moms or play in the back or things like that. And that was normal, and it didn't really bother anyone. It just seemed to be part of it. And I've been in churches where birds flew through and goats came through, and it wasn't a big deal. And so in cultures where they have a high tolerance for interruption, I say, let the children be in the meeting. And what that does is you'll find is that children pick things up even though it looks like they're not listening. I've learned that through my 3-year-old in particular. She'll hear things and then later on ask me questions or hear things, and I'll hear her repeating it back or parroting it back as she's playing with her dolls in the other room. And so I know they're always paying attention. So having children in the room is actually, in some cases, a good thing as long as your group culturally is okay with a high level of distraction. And if that's the case, then have them there by all means. Let them play around you while you're talking. Let them climb all over you. Those kind of things could be really good. Now, there are other cultures that don't deal with that level of distraction as well. For example, my wife likes to have the time in our discovery group that meets at our house, or our Bible study meets at our house or our church, where the kids aren't climbing on her because she wants to have it as adult time where she's getting the chance to have adult conversation perhaps for the first time all day because she's a stay-at-home mom. And so that's really important for her to be able to focus in and not have to worry about the distractions. And so for her, having the kids there would not be good, and she would not have a good experience if we were to have them climbing all over her. And so you got a couple of different options there. One is you wait until they're older and then you include them. When they get to the point where they can have the conversations, then they join the group, and that's something that they and then participate in the conversation. That's a good thing, and I don't know what the age is. It depends upon the maturity level as a child. I was a pretty mature younger child in that I could talk with adults really, really well. And so I was involved in meetings at a very, very early age. And yet I know some other children aren't there yet, and that's okay. It's just you've got to see where the child is and where they can participate and what they want to do. If they don't want to be in the group, I certainly wouldn't force them to be in the group because that's not the point of what we're trying to do. So in those cases, or in other cases, you might want to sit there and have a separate group for children. And what that is you assign somebody, either an adult or an older child or a youth or a teenager, can be in charge of the group, and they can actually lead a Discovery Bible study with the children. And that works out really, really well. Very, very simple. You simplify the questions, you simplify the stories, and you take them through the discovery process. I've done it with my kids. They read like the Jesus Storybook, I think is what it's called, or a story Bible. Any story Bible will do. They read that, and we just ask basic questions. You know, what do you think this says about God? What does it say about people? And if you believe this was from God, what would we have to do as a family to obey it? I remember a time when I was riding in the car with my little girl. She was just in first grade at that time, had learned how to read, and which is a miracle for me that you send them to people and they come back and they learn how to read. That's an amazing thing since I didn't have to teach them to do it. It's wonderful. And I appreciate our teachers who take the time to do that. Just a little shout out to them. But I remember driving to school, and driving her to school, and she sat there and she said, "Daddy, I read the story of Noah last night in my children's Bible." And I got super excited because now my daughter voluntarily read God's Word, and she's only a first grader, and it was amazing. And I said, "Okay, Yael, that's great. Well, what does it say about God?" And she answered, and I said, "Well, what does it tell us about people?" And she answered, and I said, and what do you think we need to do as a family to obey this passage? And she thought about it a little bit. She says, Daddy, we need to take the time to learn to listen and hear and recognize God's voice, because that's important. And I was blown away that my daughter could pick that out of the passage. And then she goes, and as a parent, you know that the most interesting things always follow the and. She goes, and we need to check the weather every day. And I said, well, honey, could you help me understand where you found that in the Noah story? Because it doesn't exactly say go check the weather. And she rolls her eyes as only a 7-year-old could do. And she says, Daddy, to see if a flood is coming. Because you see, she hadn't gotten the rest of the story yet, the promise that there wouldn't be a flood. And so she only was going on what she had read. And the funny thing is that she ended up, for the next couple of weeks, going in and pulling up Google every day and checking the weather, and then letting her mommy, Christy, my wife, and I know what we were supposed to wear each day. You know, the funny thing is I think God accepted that obedience from her, you know, as a 7-year-old, as a young child. I've been following the Lord for about 30 years now, and, you know, He wouldn't take that from me because He expects more of me. And so that's the great thing about the Discovery Bible Study, is that when you ask the question, what can you do to obey, or what do we need to do to obey, it gives them the chance to feed into it. And that's awesome, you know, and couple things. The other thing with the group of children, I've done it before, where it's been one presenter and multiple generations of children from 1st grade on to 8th grade, or 6th grade, I think. 1st to 6th is what I had. And did it the same way. Asked all the questions, you know, read and told the story, asked all the questions. The key thing to remember if you're doing a group of mixed age of children is start with the youngest child first when you ask the questions and work your way on to the oldest. Because what will happen is if the older people answer first, then the younger people think they don't have anything to add. But if a younger child answers first, the older children often think, well, I can do better than that. And so it encourages them to get involved where they may have held back before, and it allows an opportunity for the young people to speak and be heard, which is really important. And the only caveat I'd make on that is in cultures where that wouldn't be okay. For example, I learned recently in a Native American culture that starting with the youngest person in the room and working your way up to the oldest person might not be acceptable, and you'd want to start with the older and work down to the younger. So you have to be culturally sensitive in that standing, in that regard. The key things to remember when working with children is they have very short attention spans the younger they are. So I remember taking my children to school, and it was about a 15-minute walk, and I would push my son. My oldest daughter would walk. We didn't have the 3-year-old yet, and we'd push him to school, and I would cover one of the 10 commandments each day for 10 days. And that was all it took, is we'd ask you, what are you thankful for? What are you stressed out about? And I'd hear from them. And then we'd say, okay, what did we talk about yesterday? And they would tell me the commandment. And I'd say, okay, today we're going to do this commandment. And then what does that tell us about God? What does it tell us about people? And what do you think we should do as a family to obey that commandment? I took them through all the plagues that way too, because I'm weird like that. And we were working our way through the whole story of the Exodus from Egypt. So because I'd been traveling in Egypt lately, and that was part of the conversation. But anyway, so it was great. One time we were walking along, and what was the passage? We were talking about having no other gods before God. And it was interesting that, you know, we had that conversation, and later on, I was telling a story about people worshiping idols, and this was like days later. And my daughter goes, ooh. And I go, what? And she goes, well, they violated the commandment. I go, which one? She says, you shall have no other gods before God. And I was like, yes. So the conversation part sinks in. And she was young. I think she was in kindergarten at that time, and my youngest child was in a preschool environment. So I think that it's very good to use these techniques to work with children. I think that it works well. You have to do some adaptation in terms of length of story, the simplicity of the story. I would pick stories over narrative any day. So go with, you know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John before you go with any of the letters that Paul wrote, or Peter, or John, just because they're easy to remember. I would go with Old Testament stories. I did one time with a group of 8th grade boys. I got all the troublemakers in the room, and we took them through Samuel. And my key question was, what does this story tell us about men? And is this a good example of being a man or a bad example? And do you want to be like this? And they really responded to that. And so those are just some examples of how it could work with children, how it could adapt. Could they have the fun stuff thrown in? Could they have the arts and crafts? Absolutely. I recommend doing the Bible study first and then doing the arts and crafts later, or vice versa. I mean, it's really up to you and what works best in your cultural context. But Neil, I hope that answers your question. If you have any other questions, don't hesitate to email me at pwatson@contagiousdisciplemaking.com, and maybe I'll shoot a video and answer your question next time. So catch you later. Bye.